Greetings. Thank you for being here. My name is Matthew Baldwin, professor of religion at Mars Hill University, and this is the Ideas of Jesus video podcast, episode 2. I'm joined here today by my old friend, Robert Matthew Calhoun. He goes by Matt, as do I. So we're Matt and Matt. We're old friends and compatriots, students of early Christianity from old University of Chicago days. Matt, thank you for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
Matt is the research assistant to the A.A. Bradford Chair of Religion at Texas Christian University. And he is a prolific scholar, editor of several volumes, author of the monograph Paul's Definition of the Gospel in Romans 1, which was published in Wundt in 2011. And he is author or editor most recently of this tribute volume or dialogue volume that interacts with the legacy of Hans-Dieter Betz, one of Matt's teachers back in the day, and one of mine as well at the University of Chicago. This is The Origins of New Testament Theology. Matt, thank you so much for being here today. We're going to talk about Jesus, ideas of Jesus, and the field of early Christianity, and we can range as widely as you like.
I love it.
Great. I want to start with a question that I think is probably for many students and people who are new to the study of the Gospels or who are new to questions of how research scholars approach Jesus, is this question of the distinction between the Jesus of history and Jesus as we find him in canonical scriptures. And so I'm going to ask you, is it important to distinguish between Jesus as he is portrayed in the canonical Gospels and Jesus as he was in, quote, real life? That is there an important distinction to make between the Jesus that early Christians represented in the Gospels and the historical person of Jesus of Nazareth?
I think the short answer is yes. I think that most scholars would agree. The difficulty is, of course, that the Gospels, the four canonical Gospels, Paul's letters, and other sources, later Gospels, claiming to have firsthand knowledge or to transmit actual conversations, that these are the only access to the real Jesus that we have. So the question then becomes, well, can these sources be trusted for the kinds of operations that we would like to perform with them? If the goal is to get a sense of the quote-unquote real Jesus, and one wants to say that the Gospels provide that picture, then you immediately run into the problem that the Gospels do not agree with one another on key points. This is occasionally not sufficiently emphasized, particularly by those who really have no interest in stressing the differences between the Gospels. But a close reading shows that those differences are very much there, and that it's easier to, or it's more truthful to say, I should say, that one must separate between who Jesus was in real life and the various constructions of him that we have that are partly literary and partly traditional in nature.
I wonder if you could expand on that idea of the literary and the traditional and explain how noticing that affects what we think we're doing with these books.
Okay, so I think it's helpful to, if I can step back for just a minute and talk about how the nature of our sources, our ancient sources, impede our ability to answer the kinds of questions we would like to ask. So if we pick a figure who is less fraught, less contentious, right, but still somebody that lots of people like to argue about, so let's go with Socrates.
All right.
We have numerous portraits of Socrates from antiquity. We have Aristophanes' rather unkind picture in the clouds. We have dialogues from Plato. We have dialogues from Xenophon. We have attestations of the people, of the motivations of the people who ultimately brought about his death through, through the lawsuit.
Mm.
And then we have people like Diogenes the Cynic, who saw him as sort of the ultimate skeptic and disruptor of all traditional things. So if you go in and you ask, all right, so who is the real Socrates? You immediately collide with the nature of our sources. That is, that each of those authors want you to believe that the picture that they give is real, that this is the true picture. But at the same time, the fact that we have a plurality of pictures means that they can't be reconciled. So if we want, if we want to say, okay, we need to understand who Jesus was for real, for whatever reason, right? Then stepping back from our sources and then also stepping back from ourselves is a key part of this. So I tend to be among what you might say the more skeptical camp, right? That I tend to regard the recoverability of the historical Jesus beyond generalities to be very low.
Mm.
I don't have a lot of trust in the tradition as we've received it. Socrates was a relatively famous person in his own time, right? So that in his own life was a matter of public record. And so there are certain limitations to how people who decided to talk about his life and his ideas that puts the brakes on how much revision they could do.
Mm.
Jesus was comparatively obscure, right? You get the impression from the Gospels that he was some sort of rock star, but we only have the Gospels' word on that, right? I mean, there are other sources too, but we don't get records that suggest that Jesus swept the countryside like a wildfire, which is what you might understand from, say, the Gospel of Mark. So, this is to say that I don't think that it's possible for contemporary critics to separate themselves adequately, as Albert Schweitzer pointed out,
Yes.
From the process to obtain a portrait that is uninvested, right? And whereas some scholars say, like Schweitzer himself, he came to that conclusion and then gave another portrait. And of course, what validates that portrait is that he didn't like the portrait of Jesus that he created. He said, well, basically, I wouldn't find that Jesus to be very compelling. So that gives it more truth, right?
So
Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. But,
it would be
and
kind of
also,
applying the criteria of embarrassment to
right.
Schweitzer's portrait.
Now, I also want to say that I don't think that the people who have invested their scholarly energy into this question are wasting their time, right? It's just, I would rather take my own energies and put them into the question of who are the people who thought this picture of Jesus would be important or compelling or useful or true. I think that we can talk more about the people who created and use these gospels than I think about their subject, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. So if I could just return us to the example of Socrates for a second. Let's say we could set aside Aristophanes' portrait of Socrates as satire, and therefore inherently unrealistic and not meant to be taken as a real portrait. But does that mean that we assume Xenophon and Plato were both serious in their attempts to portray Socrates, but the portraits clash? Does it come down to philosophical disagreements between Xenophon and Plato? And then if that's the case, is that also how we look at this differences that we find between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Is it a kind of difference in metaphysics and philosophy and ontology, what some people might call Christology or doctrines about who Christ was? There's differences in the texts manifest differences in opinion. do I understand these differences in the case of Socrates correctly, and can we apply that to the Gospels?
Well, I think that that's right. That to some extent, the presentations of Socrates that we get are invested in, or reflect investments in particular philosophical positions that they want Socrates to have propounded or at least to have endorsed, right?
Yeah.
And so disagreements about who is right is a natural outcome. And of course, the Platonist school itself had internal disagreements. You have the skeptical wing, and then you later have the more mystical wing. And then, Aristotle gets fed up with the whole thing and leaves. So kind of decides that he wants to develop his own procedures and positions. And so I think that when we turn to Jesus, you can see because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are sort of literarily in bed with one another, right? I don't sense for instance, from Matthew and Luke, who use Mark, a desire to overturn Mark's basic outline or the gist of most of the narratives. They're definitely steering it certain ways, right? But and of course, the inclusion in the case of Matthew of those 5 speeches of Jesus really, really do make a big. I mean, they shift the picture of Jesus considerably. But at you don't get a sense of like a real disagreement over Jesus's identity until you get to John, right? And this issue has to do with my own opinion, for what it's worth, that John has read Mark and is aware of traditions that end up in Matthew and Luke, and he thinks that this is all wrong, and that Jesus doesn't, he wasn't, born from the Holy Spirit in some ordinary, even extraordinary way, right? He wasn't from Bethlehem. He's not from Nazareth. He's from heaven. And this really shifts the whole picture. And so this does not take John out of the stream of gospel literature. If gospel literature is understood as fundamentally revelatory as opposed to historical or biographical, which is, again, my own kind of understanding of what this literature is meant to be.
So that distinction that you just made, the revelatory literature versus the historical or biographical, can you expand on that distinction? And are you claiming that is the way that ancient readers of these texts would have approached them? And in a significant way, like they would not have thought about them as we might think of them, thinking of them as historical or biographical, but rather as in important ways, revelatory?
I think that it's important to say first that literate people in antiquity understood what historiography and biography were, right? That these are genres of writing that people who could read and write were in a position to enjoy, right? And even those who were not literate could hear them read. And but these are genres that speak to kind of elite values in a way that the Gospels are coming from a different stratum of Greek and Roman culture. Even though literacy is presumed by the authors, and maybe by the readers too, right? Reader understood as audience member. But even still, so biography and historiography were about understanding the past with a view to affirming the values that are shared between the person who is telling the story and the audience that's hearing it. But it's also appeals to this notion of external truth. That even though they understood that factuality is technically impossible. And I think they understood that. They also understood that striving to be truthful is an ideal, and they appeal to that ideal even as they kind of deliberately don't follow through with it, right? If that makes sense. So it was conventional to appeal to the ideal. It was also conventional to transgress it, right? So now turning to the Gospels, now whether they, someone who picked up this, let's say this is kind of the idea that occasionally you'll hear scholars say, if somebody picks up the Gospels in a bookstore and were to start reading, what would they think? What would they think that they, where would they find it in the bookstore? What kind of shelf would it be on? Well, that assumes, first of all, that the Gospels were circulating outside of the community, and I don't think that that's something that can be assumed.
Okay.
Now, I think
We're
that
just
people
stumbling into the marketplace and picking up a copy of one of the synoptic Gospels.
Yeah, then I think that Luke pitches itself as meant to be for outsiders, but like the later apologists who have emperors as their dedicatees, that's really, they're meant to be internal texts, right? So this is this sort of sense that they are evangelistic documents, that they are the kind of thing that Paul would have walked into a market and shared from beginning to end, is difficult to imagine. So let's take Mark for an example. Mark presupposes a lot of knowledge going in the door. And if you don't have any of that presupposed knowledge, who John the Baptist was, what baptism is, who Jesus is, right? So the people who are experiencing that narrative for the first time are not doing so in a manner that is completely blind to the identities of the people involved, right? So this whole notion of the text being in some sense accessible from outside is difficult. So if they are internal literature, and if they're not meant to be the kinds of things that you could pick up in the marketplace, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not historiography or that they're not biography, right? I think that it's important to note that the Gospels are concerned to present realistic pictures of their subjects and the events. Verisimilitude is very important as a literary value as exhibited in our literature, even when they're giving us what you might call miraculous, even when they're telling us about miraculous events, there's still a hard edge of realism to the portraits.
I feel like you have an example in mind, maybe from Mark. Can you elaborate on that, where we find verisimilitude being a literary value informing the narrative?
Oh, sure. I mean, let's talk about how the woman with the flow of blood, with the hemorrhage, is described as being desperate. And then the father of the little girl who has fallen sick as being desperate. And then you've got the crowds around Jesus as he's moving around, right? That he's in this sea of desperation, of desperate humanity, of people who want to need something. And so the woman touches him thinking, and we get to see inside her head, well, if I just touch his robe, it'll make me well, right? And then you get this like almost slapstick conversation between Jesus and the disciples about whether or not he could possibly know what it is that he's claiming to know. And so there's this comedic element to it too, right? So a miracle is performed, and we, privileged as we are, to hear what Jesus says to his disciples, to hear what's going on inside the mind. This is all stuff that we don't get to have in real life, but it's all plausible, right? It's all very believable. And if you're the sort of person who thinks that Jesus is a God who hears you in your own desperation, well, this is a story that would really make contact. So the verisimilitude has to do with the sort of the kind of realism of the people who are being described and the events that are surrounding, even when you have this sort of these miraculous events occur. And so this is maybe that's not the best example, but
I think it's a good example. I'd like to redirect your question just a little bit, because we're bringing in this idea that there's a literary tradition of verisimilitude that informs the narrative, that realism of the narrative feeds into people's ideas and expectations about Jesus, say that he is a God who visits people in their desperation, or is like a God that visits. And you also mentioned that a gospel like Mark or Matthew wouldn't be carried around by a missionary apostle like Paul and then read in a public space as a form of evangelism. Well, how were these written gospels used originally? What's our evidence for that? And what do we know about how early communities or individual readers did use these written accounts?
This is one of the great mysteries. I mean, we have indications, for instance, from Justin Martyr, that passages were being read kind of in connection with, for instance, the Eucharist service, or what we assume is the Eucharist service, right? You get these little glimpses, these little hints. And this is, I think this is because early Christians were not forthcoming, even in their own literature, about what they were doing.
Mm.
And this is because without claiming that early Christianity was a mystery cult precisely, it's certainly not a cult where you got to learn everything before you even walk through the door, right? There is a rite of initiation, and there is Paul himself uses language of paradosis, of handing things over, right? And narrative is presumably part of that. So Paul has some sort of gospel narrative that he or his agents, right, are delivering, and that this delivery is part of initiation. But that does not mean that outsiders have access to them. So you can imagine that someone like Origen, discovering that Celsus had got his hands on a copy of presumably the Gospel of Matthew, that this was a problem, right? And that he needed to move in and correct that problem, right? By actually
quickly clarify for readers who may not have heard about this important early source, we have this evidence of this dialogue between, or this really polemic exchange between the early church theologian Origen of Caesarea or Alexandria and a man named Celsus, who wrote a book against the Christians, and it survives in sort of line by line takedown by the theologian Origen, the contra Celsum, and that's what Matthew is talking about.
Well, and this text is really important because it gives us a lot of insight into how an elite philosopher like Celsus, he was a medical doctor and a philosopher, and he regarded early Christianity as really just an idiotic foreign superstition, and so but also one that was, I guess, in his own mind, becoming alarmingly popular and in need of what you might call an expose. So, imagine, kind of South Park doing its expose episode on Scientology and how the Scientology people reacted to that. It was not, they were pretty annoyed. And this has to do with the fact that South Park really had no need to be truthful. I mean, maybe they were, or maybe they weren't, but the goal was to make people laugh, and to laugh particularly at a religion that
was Celsus being satirical in the way that Aristophanes or a Matt Parker, Trey Stone. Do I got that right? Trey Stone, Matt Parker.
I never can remember. Yeah,
The South Park creators,
yeah, I'm a bad Gen Xer. I can't remember their names.
right? Well, I just wonder if it's fair to compare Celsus to the satirists.
No, well, I think actually, uh, I think that he's definitely got the snide superior tone, but whether it's satire, that's another question.
Hmm.
I mean,
So
I think it's satire.
it's fair.
Yeah,
For sure.
well, and satire also is um, well, involves like literary exaggeration, for instance. So, Jonathan Swift is a satirist. Mark Twain is a satirist, even though they're not necessarily using narrative to do their satires. I think that uh, now some of Kelsus's sources may have been satires. I
Mm.
mean, Morton Smith in his book on Jesus the Magician uh, argued that and this is I think what Origen himself says, that Celsus has a Jewish source,
Mm.
and that this source is sort of an anti-gospel.
Mm.
And so,
And we know that satirists were interested in early Christianity. Lucian Samosata takes pot shots at Christians here and there without constructing an anti-gospel that we know of. And we have, of course, that famous graffito,
right,
the piece of
graffito, I think, yeah,
um, uh, depicting Jesus as a crucified donkey,
yeah,
if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, and that, I mean, of course, that's. I think that Christianity would have, well, already from Paul, we find out that outsiders regarded Christianity, insofar as they knew about it, as kind of absurd.
Mm.
Um, not
Were the
not
Gospels designed to counteract that?
I don't know. I think the Gospels are meant to underscore the value system that underpins the response to the accusation of absurdity,
Mm.
right? So the elite Roman values are the ones those are the ones that ended up with the Son of God dead, but then also resurrected, right? So the Roman values stand condemned in the Gospels, right? Just like uh, the values of um, subject peoples trying to stay out of Rome's way, right? Stand condemned. Does that make sense?
It does, although I imagine there's at least one viewer out there who's ready to argue that elite Roman values are, in fact, bolstered by the kinds of moral teachings and value systems that are discussed in the Gospels.
Who are you thinking of?
Particularly about Aaron Roberts, who has argued that the moral system of the Gospel of Matthew is, through its kind of reframing of Roman Stoicism as Jesus's value system, that it actually supports a kind of quietistic Roman cultural norms.
Well, I think that all explorations of early Christian ethical discourse and its points of contact with the ethical discourse of philosophy, which is an elite enterprise in the ancient world, largely. I think that these are important and instructive. And in fact, this is one of the key arguments that later Christians will put forward, as that Christianity is the true incarnation of all that Rome aspires to be,
Hmm.
that all the philosophers aspire to be. You could even look at Paul's references to pistis, to faith and fidelity in the opening chapter of his letter to the Romans, as a bid to that kind of thinking. And then also his interest in universalism
Hmm.
in Romans is, I think, entirely comprehensible within particularly a Roman Stoic setting. right? So I think that Paul is aware of these things, maybe the gospel writers too. I would like to see Aaron's book. I
Yeah,
will.
I think it's either just out now or coming out very soon. The truth is, Matt, is I'd actually like to return to the topic of revelatory literature or revelation and understanding the Gospels as a form of revelatory literature that you brought up earlier in our talk.
Okay, so there's a big kind of ongoing debate, you might say, in scholarship about where the Gospels fit on the literary landscape. And we've already talked a little bit about how the Gospels are not the sort of literature that you walk into a bookstore and just pick up, right? That they're meant for internal use. They're not, at least as far as I can tell, evangelistic in nature because they seem to be geared toward insiders, people who already know, and that they are meant to reinforce. They're not meant to promote conversion, they're meant to reinforce, you might say. Okay? So, however, so there's this discussion about whether or not the Gospels should be classified as biography.
Right.
Richard Burridge very famously has written about this. He has a whole group of so you might call them disciples, who agree with him on this point. And then there's another camp who very firmly want to locate it in historiography. Both camps very correctly note that both types of literature are very closely related. And so you could really look at biography as a species of historiography, and what they're fighting about and why it matters so much is a bit mystifying, perhaps.
For a lot of people, it probably is.
But I think that Paul's own statements about what the gospel is are often omitted from this discussion, and I think it's curious that none of the four gospels internally refer to themselves as gospels. So Mark, depending on what chapter 1, verse 1 is doing, right? This is open to debate. I mean, is it signifying, hey, Gospel of Mark begins here, right? That's one theory. Others don't regard it as a title. They regard it as the origin of the Gospel of Mark, and then it contained the origin of the Gospel, right, or the beginning of the Gospel, and then it continues into the sentence. I kind of mangled that. Okay, that's because I was getting ahead of myself. Now, I'm inclined to think that word beginning is origin, and that the Mark is designating, the evangelist is designating his text not the gospel, but the narrative of where the gospel comes from. A lot of cults, and I use that term comprehensively, not disparagingly. We're not referring to them as sort of.
It might be worth saying that ancient historians refer to religious groups as cults without disparagement.
That's right. So the a lot of cults from the ancient world that were located in particular places have sort of cult foundation narratives of how the worship of Isis came to X spot, how the worship of Asclepius came to X spot. Now, this is really important for some of the major sanctuaries, like Epidaurus for Asclepius, right? These types of accounts are an important part of locating the cult in the real world, and so they have kind of a historical character, but they're also conventionally constructed, and this has been shown by James Hengis and by his professor, whose name is escaping me.
That's okay.
Anyway, so wrote on this, and it's a fascinating book, and it's looking at, particularly, I think, the book of Acts as a cult foundation narrative. So he collects all the sources. Now, this is all to say that these accounts are not exactly historiography, exactly biography. They are kind of quasi-mythical, but they're also located in the real. They involve the God giving instructions to somebody about what to do. Sometimes that means going and getting a statue and bringing it to a certain place. There's some resistance, and so you get the idea. Now, Christian cult does not have a place. It is translocal. It's the worship of the God is not based. There's no evidence that early Christians understood their churches to be places in the same way that other cults had sanctuaries.
Right.
It's a very different concept of how to do worship, you might say. And I think this is reflected in its cult foundation narratives, right? So, but if we go back to what Paul says about what the gospel is, he says that it is God's power resulting in salvation for everyone who believes, because God's justice is revealed in it faith to faith. So that's from Romans 1:16 and 17, famous thesis statement of the letter.
Right.
Paul has defined
the book,
gospel.
if you want to know more about this, need to read Calhoun on this.
Well, I think it's my pet project, you might say. So this notion of the gospel as divine power, which produces soteria, which produces security, safety, salvation. You can take that word a number of different ways. But it also reveals, in it is revealed divine justice. So when early Christians take that label gospel and they apply it to these four accounts, we don't really know when that happens, by the way, but when they do, that's telling us something, I think, about what they understand those accounts to be. And I think that what they understand those accounts to be is revelatory. That the text reveals a deity, right? A deity who got his start as a human being and who died and was raised and then promoted, you might say, seated at the right hand of God, to borrow Paul's language, right? So this is a...
Just to be clear, I think, and this fits in with what you were saying earlier, for John, John corrects that idea that the deity is starting human and then being promoted.
That's correct. Yeah, but I think John is also quite emphatic that Jesus' human sojourn is real, right? So John is engaging early Christians who had a different notions of what Jesus' sojourn on earth entails in terms of materiality. There are different theological presuppositions at work. One of these is that the celestial and the terrestrial belong in different boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And so different early Christians rectified these ideas differently. So when you call the gospel a revelation, when you call it, if we see early Christians, when they close the loop between Paul's use of gospel and these four texts, especially when they were collected together, they were telling us something, I think, about what they understood these texts to do and to be, right? So I am not the first person, of course, to suggest that the Gospels are revelatory literature. There's been some discussion about whether or not the Gospel of John has apocalyptic features. And now, I've not really done a lot of reading on this. I kind of know about it indirectly. But this is, whatever the Gospels are, they don't look like the book of Daniel. They don't look like the book of Revelation. They don't look like the shepherd of Hermas, right? So that's a hard sell. But I think that the insight is on point, right? That if the Gospels, the narrative also, don't look a whole lot to us like the revelatory Gospels that you get from Nag Hammadi, there's always been that question of how can those revelatory Gospels and what we get in the four canonical Gospels, how can they carry the same? And I think the answer is that they aren't as different in the minds of the people who were composing and using these texts as we think they are, right? Because they were less hung up on formal features and more interested in question of function. What is the text presenting itself as doing?
So if I understand the distinction you're drawing correctly between, say, a bios or biography and revelatory text, it sounds like the distinction is one that is about the society, social use of the text.
Yeah, no, I think this is not adequately emphasized. If you look at genre theory in the ancient world, it grows largely out of Aristotle's discussion of tragedy on the one hand, right? Literary critics love that because that is the birth of poetics, right? Birth of literary criticism as we know it today. But genre theory in the ancient world is largely utilitarian, and it is mostly focused on issues of function, and it comes up through rhetoric. So there are certain stereotyped literatures for venues and moments. So if you're in a lawsuit, the venue is a court, and your stereotyped forms are the speech of defense and the speech of prosecution, right? And so certain conventions solidify strategies, you might say, for achieving certain objectives, kind of schematically conceived objectives within that venue and within those parameters. So we think, well, what does that have to do with tragedy? Well, staged at a festival dedicated to Dionysus. Now, this is some interesting implications, I think, for ritual conceptions of tragedy, right? I think that classicists believe that this can be overstated and probably shouldn't be pushed too hard. I'm going to defer to their judgment on that. I don't know, right? But what I'm saying is that I don't regard the presentation of tragedy connected with the Dionysiac festival as accidental. How about that, right? So that there is a sort of broad civic ritual context for the literary form, right? So this is why I think that when we talk about genre, approaching this like people discussing contemporary novels, short stories, poetry, plays, where issues of social setting are largely set aside, right? Because our literature is mass produced through stereographic technology and is not reliant on particular social settings for even general understandings of what the work of literature might or might not be for. Does that make sense?
I think it does. I keep coming back to the concrete example in my mind of a kind of a first timer in an ecclesia, in an early Christian communal setting. Someone
Right.
coming in from the marketplace, following after someone like Paul or one of Paul's disciples, and into the community, passing through the process of preparation for baptism. And I'm wondering at what point they start to encounter Jesus in the literary form of these texts, and when they start to do that, what they know already or presume already, and how those texts then inform their thinking or their ideas about Jesus. And I always return to the notion of people having the idea of Jesus. Now I'm thinking about that early convert and how this more abstract conversation about genre types and social setting would apply to their experience.
Okay, so Margaret Mitchell, my doctoral professor, has recently done some work on the Gospels as literary epiphanies. That's what she refers. And this gets right. So my idea about revelatory literature is very. It's meant to be in my own head joined with her idea of the gospel being epiphanic, that they serve the function very similar to a cult statue. I'm not sure that she would say this. I don't want to put words in her mouth. But what I would say is that an epiphany is something one experiences in an ancient cultic context when one views the statue.
That makes sense.
And so
A statue belongs to a particular sanctuary, which has a location.
that's correct. So this goes back to our earlier notion of Christianity being peculiar and
not having particular sanctuary locations.
That's right. And
the speech or the speech acts of the community.
Now, I think it's important to be very careful about suggesting that because Christianity has a prehistory as a Jewish sect, you might say, that it is likewise aniconic in a rigorous way, right? That they don't use statues, they don't use icons, they don't have pictures of Jesus. The fact is, we just don't have a lot of evidence, right? And some of the earliest evidence we have, for instance, of depictions of crucified figures are on amulets, which is fascinating, right? So that means that I believe that those pictures of the crucifixion are meant to be to capture the gospel as divine power, and then to materialize it in such a way that it can be kept on the person for personal safety, which is another way of translating soteria, salvation, right? So I've written a bit about this in connection with gospel amulets, right? Now, these early pictures of the crucifixion, they're not super early, 3rd century, right? Maybe 2nd, I don't really know. But it's they don't date themselves very easily. But I think we have to be careful about making assumptions of the degree of hostility toward images of divine images in early Christianity when we don't have much in the way of material evidence, right? However, I think that it would make sense in the absence of a cult statue to create a literary cult statue, you might say, that is orally presented in a context of initiation, such that initiation, an epiphanic moment, right, an epiphany of the deity becomes part of the initiatory experience. Now, this is very speculative. I mean, we don't have any hard evidence of this as far as I know. But I think that this makes pretty good sense of the evidence that we have for at least something like the Gospel of Mark, right? Which, by the way, is very focused on vivid description, right?
Yes.
And I mean, this is part of what literary critics today, once Mark kind of came out of the shadows, an appreciation for the vividness of his narration was something that literary critics noticed. And I think rightly so. I mean, it's a very compelling story for this reason. So if we might understand, therefore, the function of a gospel, potentially at least, as being similar to the function of a cult statue. It doesn't receive worship precisely, although it is understood to be imbued with divine power. And it is also something which is epiphanic in character. It is revealing features of the God to viewers such that they may know them and experience them and understand them and internalize them and form sort of what we call devotional cusps, right? We might call devotional cusps, faith, right?
What you're talking about is actually, for me, flagging some fairly interesting thoughts or bringing them up. We mentioned Burridge, and the notion that the Gospels are bioi is strongly associated with his work, but he's also got a textbook for students called 4 Gospels, 4 Portraits, in which, or that's the subtitle, in which the idea is that the Gospels present distinct portraits of Jesus, and he uses this as a metaphor, but if the framework that you're suggesting is to be taken seriously, that's more than a metaphor. That, you know, these are icons, and they present revelations of Jesus. So far from being able to go through the texts using some sort of historiographical method in a modern context so that we can find the real Jesus, what we have when we encounter the Gospels are these ancient cult images, if you will.
Mhm.
That, they stand there, not exactly mute since they're text, but it's very hard to get through them either to some real being that stands behind them. You know, we aren't looking for the historical Asclepius. And for the listener who's not
Exactly.
aware of this, Asclepius is a divine human figure who is associated with a very important and widespread healing cult in antiquity, associated with the god Apollo. And Asclepius is himself a god, of course. But if we were to view the Gospels as analogous to a cult statue of Asclepius, portrayed with his various images and icons that tie into narratives about him or about his followers, if we understand that analogy, then it becomes almost futile for us to start searching beyond them, and we need to instead think about the ways that they were used in and with the ways that they mediated institutional social formations in early Christianity.
I think that's exactly right. And another way of saying this, to just kind of put it in a little brief package, perhaps, is that they tell us a lot about the priorities of the people who created the cult image. Right? Now, that is not detached from tradition. So, when a sculptor in antiquity was creating an image that was meant to be for a functioning temple, there were certain you might call signs that made sure that the god could be identified, right? And that these, Poseidon holding his trident, right? Zeus with his thunderbolt, whatever you want to call these, right? And these are cues that locate the image within a broader traditional frame. And so Jesus is not a cult figure without a past. And so Mark is careful to include, I think, the requisite elements. And these are what, insofar as the Gospels give us solid information about the historical Jesus, I think these are probably the nuggets that we get, right? That he was born in, maybe Bethlehem, maybe Nazareth, right? That he's definitely grew up in Nazareth, that he had 12 disciples, that he came to Jerusalem, that he ultimately was killed, right? So these are generalities. And on top of this, you can also talk about him being a wonder worker, an exorcist, a healer, a prophet figure, a wisdom figure, someone who spoke in parables. I think that these are all generally true. Now, whether Jesus spoke this exact parable using these exact words, well, I don't know how we would know that, right? But this is, I think that the picture that we get in its qualities is probably something we can accept and outline. Now, if I may just append a little observation here, some of these stories, like we were talking earlier about the woman with the hemorrhage and the little girl. Roy Catania an interesting article arguing that the woman with the flow of blood is a Demeter figure, and that the little girl who is referred in the text as Cora, is a Persephone figure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now he's also written an essay that I've not read in quite a while. I meant to read before our talk today, and just how it goes. So, but at any rate, if we've got these little what you might call human representatives of divinities. So let's talk about the guy in the tomb, right? The one with the legion of demons. as potentially a Hades figure,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that Jesus is emptying Hades of all of the legion inside him, and kind of,
Oh my goodness.
right. So you have potentially this motif of Jesus among the gods as sort of a subtext, or um, a, a way of placing Jesus among divinities and asserting power over their spheres. Jesus is a resurrected deity who promises eternal life. And so he is asserting power over the chief chthonic deities, potentially, right? But
That's a pretty good
also,
example because certainly, as Christian tradition develops, this is precisely what's asserted about Jesus, is that he.
well, right, you have the clash of gods motif in iconography,
Yes.
right? So this is a uh, I have a book on my shelf that I ordered and haven't read yet that actually has that in the title, and it's talking about early Christian iconography and how it uses uh, classical motifs,
A great
reuses
book.
them in Christian
A really good
context. It's
book.
really cool. So, all right, so you also have Jesus giving prophetic pronouncements, which puts him on Apollo's turf. And he also is performing healings, which puts him on Asclepius's turf. He is essentially standing on everybody else's dirt, right? And saying, this is mine now.
Hmm.
And in a way, the Gospels are revealing these, kind of turning them upside down and showing them for the impoverished shadows that they really are, right? That they're not real gods. And so let's go back to Genesis 1 through 11 for a minute. If you look at those first 11 chapters of Genesis, and you see, you lay them up against myths of the origin of human culture and of the world, from the classical world and from the ancient Near East, the naturalism and almost, you might say, the humanism of these accounts is striking,
Hmm.
right? That there's almost a kind of an Epicurean urge to assert that it's all just a metaphor, a shadow, that these gods are just, um, Epicurean is not the word I was looking for, but the idea that you can reduce these narratives to kind of more mundane origins,
Were you talking
right?
about euhemerus?
Euhemerus, that's right. I can't believe I blanked on that.
That's all right.
I wrote a paper on euhemerus. How embarrassing. So anyway, so this is all to say that this type of naturalistic presentation of other deities puts Mark's in the tradition of Hebrew narrative, in addition to keeping it within the broader Greco-Roman literary context, right? So this is a sign of true literary mastery, but it's also like rigorously directed toward making the hearer, the viewer who's viewing the story in their mind, hear it, experience, to undergo the events and come out transformed with their perspectives about other deities, for instance, or about their place in the world and what it means to be a disciple and what the cost of that discipleship might ultimately be. All of these things become possible through going through the narrative with the storyteller. And thus, you have a gospel, an epiphanic medium, right? That is not just like a stationary statue, right? It's more than that.
It becomes really
So
the basis for preaching and for community formation, social formation as
yeah.
well.
So if you're, if anybody listening to our conversation, hopefully there will be people who listen to our conversation. If they say to themselves, "Hey, Matt, what does that mean for the factuality of the accounts?" Well, it means that chances are good that there isn't much beyond generalities. And then what that means is that scholars should be, I think, extremely reserved about moving details from the story into what you might call contemporary historiographic accounts of Jesus's life and those of his disciples.
Well, Matt, I have to say that I find all of this very compelling, and I think that there's just a very strong argument to be made on the basis of thinking about these texts within the context of the movement, the early movement that produced and used them, to not engage in this act of trying to reconstruct Jesus by removing all of the juice from these fascinating epiphanic objects, text objects
Right.
that were so important in an ancient religious movement that in fact for thousands or millions of people today continue to function in analogous ways. You remove that juice looking for some kind of core, I don't think you have much left.
Well, I agree. And by the way, the Gospels are continuing to serve as cult objects, you might say, in Christianity as a living religion.
They are.
Right? And there is no, there's a tendency to see scholarship on one side and, lived religious uses of the Gospels on the other side. And I think that we need to keep these kind of discourse zones separate, right? In other words, my research on the Gospels should not be answerable to questions of theological application or validity, right? Nor should my conclusions be dictated by something outside of the sources. This is all to say, however, that we can appreciate the Gospels as a continuously vital religious artifact, you might say.
Yeah.
These pictures of Jesus are continuously renewed through the proclamation or the reading of these Sunday to Sunday to Sunday to Sunday, and so this is I think that my theory about the kind of cultic artifactual / revelatory epiphanic nature of these texts, right, might make it easier for them to be, well, it might, I don't know about make it easier, but it speaks to their continuing functionality too.
Yeah,
right?
It also helps to explain the enduring presence of them in religious movements that are around us today. Man, I think it's a great place for us to bring this conversation to a close. Although you and I, we could go on talking for hours and hours, I'm sure.
And we have.
And we have, and we will again. We will again. I may have to bring you back at some point for a renewal of our conversation on Jesus at a time in the future. I'm so thankful for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Matt. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing from you. What kind of reactions the video produces